Bullies grabbed the girl's glasses. She flipped him hard enough to break the floor. Kieran Blackwood moved through the crowded hallways of Lincoln High School like a shadow cast by someone more substantial, her slight frame barely registering on the radar of hundreds of bustling students who pushed past her with the casual indifference reserved for furniture or fixtures. At barely 5 feet tall, with unruly auburn hair that seemed to have a mind of its own, and thick-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose, despite her repeated efforts to push them back into place, she had mastered the delicate art of invisibility with the precision of someone who had learned that being noticed often meant being targeted. Her clothes hung loose on her thin frame, like hand-me-downs from an older sibling she didn't have, the fabric seeming to dwarf her already small stature and making her appear even more fragile than she actually was. The sleeves of her oversized sweater covered her hands completely, leaving only her fingertips visible when she reached for door handles or textbooks, and her worn jeans bunched at the ankles where they pooled over sneakers that had seen better days. She kept her head down as she navigated the social minefield of high school, clutching the frayed straps of her discount store backpack like lifelines that might somehow anchor her to safety in a sea of teenage cruelty and indifference. What none of her classmates knew, what she had never mentioned to a single soul within the walls of Lincoln High, was that every Tuesday and Thursday evening for the past 8 years, Kieran disappeared into the humble confines of Master Chen's martial arts studio downtown. The studio occupied the second floor of a nondescript brick building wedged between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner, accessible only by a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under the weight of students making their way to evening classes. Inside, beneath fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally and over mats that had been worn smooth by thousands of bare feet, Kieran had earned her black belt in Taekwondo through years of disciplined training, countless hours of repetitive practice, and a dedication that surprised even her instructors. Her parents had enrolled her in martial arts classes after a particularly devastating incident when she was 10 years old, when neighborhood kids had pushed her off her bike while she was riding home from the library, sending her tumbling onto the asphalt with scraped knees and wounded pride that stung far worse than any physical injury. The decision had been made with the best of intentions, to give their quiet, bookish daughter the tools to defend herself in a world that seemed determined to prey upon the gentle and vulnerable. But Kieran had never mentioned her training at school, never hinted at the years of discipline and physical conditioning that lay hidden beneath her oversized sweaters and self-deprecating manner. The quiet girl who flinched visibly when people raised their voices in anger or frustration, who seemed to shrink into herself whenever conflict arose in her vicinity, was the same person who could break thick wooden boards with her bare hands and execute jumping kicks that would make Olympic athletes pause in admiration. During sparring sessions at the studio, she moved with a fluid grace that transformed her from awkward teenager into something approaching poetry in motion, her techniques precise and powerful despite her diminutive size. Master Chen often used her as an example when teaching newer students about the importance of technique over brute strength, how proper form and years of practice could overcome significant disadvantages in size and weight. Lincoln High School sprawled across 15 carefully manicured acres in suburban Colorado, its red brick buildings and pristine lawns giving it the kind of academic respectability that parents bragged about to their neighbors and featured prominently in real estate listings. The school prided itself on its championship football team, whose victories were celebrated with elaborate pep rallies and whose players received hero worship typically reserved for celebrities, and its consistently high college acceptance rates that kept property values elevated throughout the district. Glossy brochures showcased smiling students engaged in various academic and extracurricular activities, painting a picture of an institution where every child could thrive and reach their full potential. But like most institutions that existed primarily to maintain their own reputation, Lincoln High had dark corners where administration's watchful eye didn't reach, blind spots where the carefully crafted image of academic excellence and social harmony gave way to something far more sinister. The outdoor lunch courtyard, with its scattered picnic tables arranged beneath large oak trees that had been planted decades earlier by optimistic groundskeepers, had become hunting ground for those who found entertainment in the suffering of others. The stairwell near the gymnasium, always dimly lit due to a maintenance budget that prioritized more visible areas, served as another favorite spot for those who preferred to conduct their cruelty without the inconvenience of witnesses who might feel compelled to intervene. These spaces existed in a strange twilight zone of administrative awareness, places that teachers and staff knew could be problematic, but which were difficult to monitor constantly without seeming to turn the school into a prison. The result was a tacit understanding among students that certain areas were lawless territories where the normal rules of civilized behavior didn't apply, where the strong preyed upon the weak with impunity, as long as they were careful not to leave evidence that would force adults to acknowledge what everyone already knew was happening. Kieran had been attending Lincoln High for 3 years now, ever since her family moved to Colorado, when her father got transferred by his engineering firm to work on a major infrastructure project that was supposed to last at least 5 years. She had hoped desperately that starting fresh in a new state might give her a chance to reinvent herself, to shed the awkward skin of her middle school years and emerge as someone more confident, more socially adept, more capable of navigating the complex social hierarchies that seemed to govern teenage existence. For exactly 1 week, she had allowed herself to believe that her geographic reset might also be a social one. But within the first week of classes, she had somehow painted a target on her back with the precision of someone following a manual for victim selection. Maybe it was the way she stumbled over words when called on in class, her voice barely audible as she tried to answer questions while feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Maybe it was how she ate lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, absorbed in fantasy novels that transported her to worlds where the meek occasionally inherited something more valuable than the earth. Maybe it was simply that she looked like someone who wouldn't fight back, who would absorb abuse silently and never report incidents that might bring uncomfortable scrutiny to those who found entertainment in others' misery. Whatever the reason, and she had spent countless sleepless nights trying to identify the exact moment when her fate had been sealed, she became a magnet for students who found genuine entertainment in making others miserable. It started small, as these things always did, with whispered comments and barely audible snickering that could easily be dismissed as imagination or paranoia. But escalation was inevitable, as natural as water flowing downhill, and what began as occasional incidents evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that would define the next 2 years of her life. Trent Garrison ruled the school's elaborate social hierarchy with the kind of easy confidence that came from being 6 feet tall, naturally athletic, and blessed with an easy smile that made teachers and administrators assume he was fundamentally a good kid, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, with just enough apparent effort to look effortless, and he wore his letter jacket like a suit of armor, each patch and pin announcing his status as starting quarterback and student council vice president to anyone who might have missed the memo about his importance in the school's social ecosystem. To most adults, Trent was the picture of an all-American teenager, the kind of clean-cut young man who said, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," to teachers, who held doors open for faculty members, and who could deliver a speech at a school assembly that would bring parents to tears with its message of school spirit and community values. His GPA was respectable, if not exceptional, His disciplinary record was spotless, and his extracurricular involvement was exactly what college admissions officers looked for in prospective students. To students like Kieran, however, he was something far more dangerous. A predator who had learned to camouflage his true nature beneath a veneer of respectability that made him nearly untouchable. Flanking Trent in his daily movements through the school were his two closest allies, boys who had attached themselves to his rising star early in their high school careers and who now served as both audience and accomplices to his various cruelties. Derek Matthews was a stocky wrestler whose idea of humor invariably involved some form of physical intimidation, whether it was blocking hallways, accidentally bumping into smaller students, or using his considerable bulk to crowd people against lockers while pretending to reach for something just beyond them. His wrestling background gave him an intimate knowledge of pressure points and joint manipulation that he employed with surgical precision to inflict maximum discomfort without leaving marks that might prompt inconvenient questions. Blake Porter, the third member of their triumvirate, possessed a sharp tongue that could reduce someone to tears with the surgical precision of a scalpel wielded by someone who understood exactly where to cut for maximum damage. He had an uncanny ability to identify and exploit insecurities, to find the exact words that would burrow under someone's skin and fester there long after the initial encounter had ended. Where Derek relied on physical intimidation, Blake specialized in psychological warfare, crafting insults and observations that seemed almost casual, but were calculated to destroy confidence and self-worth with devastating efficiency. The trio had perfected their routine over years of practice, developing an understanding of each other's strengths and roles that allowed them to tag-team their victims with devastating effectiveness. More importantly, they had learned exactly how far they could push without crossing lines that would bring serious consequences from school administration or angry parents. They were smart bullies, which made them infinitely more dangerous than the obvious thugs who eventually got expelled or arrested for their more flagrant violations of school policy. The first incident between Trent's group and Kieran happened during her sophomore year, on a Tuesday morning that had started normally enough with her usual routine of arriving early to avoid the crowds and settling into her first period chemistry class with the relief of someone who had successfully navigated another gauntlet. She was rushing through the hallways between second and third period when she accidentally bumped into Trent while trying to squeeze past a group of students clustered around someone's locker. The collision was minor, barely more than a brush of shoulders, but it sent her carefully balanced armload of textbooks tumbling to the floor in a cascade of paper and binding that seemed to echo through the hallway like thunder. Her books scattered across the polished linoleum with the kind of dramatic flair that seemed designed to attract maximum attention, loose papers floating like autumn leaves before settling in random patterns that would take several minutes to collect and reorganize. When she scrambled to gather them, moving with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew that every second spent on her knees made her more vulnerable to the predators who circled just beyond her peripheral vision, Trent stepped deliberately on her chemistry notebook, grinding his heel into pages of carefully written notes that represented hours of study and preparation. "Watch where you're going, Four Eyes," he said, with that charming smile that had fooled so many adults, his tone carrying just enough mock concern to provide plausible deniability if any teacher happened to overhear. His words were accompanied by snickers from Blake, who made loud observations about how maybe she needed stronger glasses or perhaps a seeing-eye dog to help her navigate the complex challenge of walking in a straight line. Derek, not to be outdone in the creativity department, accidentally kicked her pencil case down the hall with enough force to send its contents scattering like buckshot, pencils and pens rolling under lockers and into corners where they would be difficult to retrieve. The whole incident lasted perhaps 30 seconds from beginning to end, but it established a pattern that would define the next 2 years of Kieran's life, with the inevitability of a mathematical proof. In those 30 seconds, she learned that she was fair game, that her suffering was entertainment, and that any expectation of help or intervention from the dozens of students who witnessed the encounter was nothing more than wishful thinking. The message was delivered with surgical precision. She was alone, vulnerable, and completely at their mercy. At first, the incidents were sporadic and relatively minor, carefully spaced to avoid creating a pattern that might attract administrative attention or concern from teachers who prided themselves on maintaining order in their classrooms and hallways. A shoulder check in the hallway that sent her stumbling into lockers with enough force to leave bruises that would fade just in time for the next encounter. Comments about her clothes or appearance delivered just loud enough for nearby students to hear and laugh. Observations about her obvious poverty, as evidenced by her discount store backpack and second-hand sneakers that had been repaired with duct tape. Her lunch would get accidentally knocked off tables in the cafeteria during the busy noon rush, leaving her to clean up the mess of spilled milk and scattered food while fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. Each incident was carefully calibrated to be deniable, explainable as an accident, or harmless teasing if any adult questioned the participants about their behavior. The cruelty was systematic but subtle, designed to fly under the radar of authority figures who were already overwhelmed with more obvious disciplinary problems. Kieran's initial response was exactly what her tormentors wanted and expected. She absorbed the humiliation silently, cleaned up their messes without complaint, and tried even harder to stay invisible, as if perfect compliance might somehow earn her a reprieve from their attention. She told herself that fighting back would only make things worse, that drawing additional attention would escalate the situation beyond her ability to control or endure. More importantly, she had made a solemn promise to her parents when they enrolled her in martial arts classes that she would never use her training to hurt anyone unless her life was in genuine, immediate danger. Martial arts is about discipline and self-control, her father had explained on the drive to her first lesson, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that knowledge could be dangerous in the wrong hands. It's not about winning fights or proving how tough you are. It's about avoiding conflicts whenever possible and protecting yourself only when there's absolutely no other choice. Those words echoed in her mind every time Trent and his friends pushed her boundaries, even as part of her itched to show them exactly what 8 years of dedicated training had taught her about the relationship between size and strength. The adults in her life notice things, as adults often do when children are suffering, but lack the context or courage to address the root causes of what they observe. Mrs. Peterson, her English teacher, noticed occasional bruises on Kieran's arms during warm weather when short sleeves made concealment impossible, and asked with genuine concern if everything was all right at home. Mr. Williams, the gym teacher, observed how Kieran flinched whenever students got too close during team activities, how she seemed to anticipate physical contact with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect pain from unexpected directions. But when pressed for details about her injuries or her obvious anxiety, Kieran always had ready explanations that adults wanted to believe because the alternatives were too complicated and uncomfortable to address. She was naturally clumsy, she explained with self-deprecating humor that made teachers smile sympathetically. She bruised easily, a genetic quirk that ran in her family and made even minor bumps look like evidence of serious trauma. She preferred to keep to herself, not because of any problems with other students, but because she was naturally introverted and found large groups overwhelming and stressful. The adults wanted desperately to believe her explanations because the alternative meant acknowledging that something ugly and systematic was happening under their watch, and intervention would mean paperwork and difficult conversations with the parents of popular students who contributed significantly to booster clubs and fundraising efforts. It was easier to accept her explanations and move on to problems that seemed more manageable and less politically complicated. Other students noticed too, because teenagers are remarkably observant when it comes to social dynamics and power structures, but their reactions fell into predictable categories that Kieran had learned to recognize and expect. Some felt genuine sympathy for her situation, but were too afraid of becoming targets themselves to risk intervention, understanding with adolescent clarity that the ecosystem of high school cruelty required a certain number of victims to function properly. Others found cruel entertainment in watching someone else absorb the negative attention they might otherwise receive, taking comfort in the knowledge that as long as Kieran existed as a lightning rod for abuse, they were relatively safe from similar treatment. A few students seemed to take active comfort in knowing they weren't at the bottom of the social food chain, that their own awkwardness or insecurities paled in comparison to someone who was genuinely powerless and friendless. The bystander effect flourished in Lincoln High's hallways like a particularly aggressive weed, where everyone learned that the safest response to witnessing cruelty was to look away and walk faster, to pretend they hadn't seen anything that might require them to make uncomfortable moral choices about intervention and consequences. As junior year progressed with the relentless march of seasons and semesters, the incidents escalated in both frequency and severity. Trent and his friends grew bolder, perhaps sensing that Kieran would never report them or fight back, perhaps simply bored with the limited entertainment value of their previous tactics. They began timing their encounters for maximum humiliation, striking during the busy lunch rush when the cafeteria was packed with potential witnesses who could spread word of her latest degradation throughout the school's extensive social network. Derek would accidentally bump into Kieran while she carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria, his movements perfectly choreographed to send food flying and her milk carton exploding across the floor in a spectacular display that never failed to draw attention and laughter. The entire cafeteria would turn to look as she knelt to clean up the mess with flimsy paper napkins that disintegrated immediately upon contact with liquids, her face burning with embarrassment as conversations resumed around her with the casual indifference of people returning to their regularly scheduled entertainment. The stairwell near the gymnasium became their favorite hunting ground for verbal harassment and psychological torture, the acoustics of the space carrying their laughter and comments throughout the area, while its isolation ensured that no teachers would witness their encounters or be forced to intervene. They discovered through careful observation that Kieran's route to sixth period biology took her through this area every day at exactly 1:47 p.m., and they began timing their own movements to intersect with hers, with the precision of predators who had studied their prey's habits extensively. Blake would make increasingly personal comments about her appearance, her clothes, her family's obvious lack of money, as evidenced by her discount store backpack and second-hand sneakers that had been repaired multiple times with increasingly creative applications of duct tape and determination. Derek would suggest helpful improvements to her overall presentation, loudly wondering if she had ever considered contact lenses or a different haircut, or maybe just transferring to a different school entirely where her particular brand of awkwardness might be more socially acceptable. Trent would play the role of the reasonable one in these encounters, occasionally telling his friends to take it easy or give her a break, while doing absolutely nothing to actually stop their behavior or address its fundamental cruelty. His mock interventions served a dual purpose. They gave him plausible deniability if any adult questioned him about his involvement, and they created a sick psychological dynamic where Kieran might actually feel grateful to him for the occasional moments of respite from his friends' more direct attacks. Through it all, Kieran endured with the grim determination of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required becoming smaller, quieter, and more invisible than seemed humanly possible. She developed elaborate strategies for navigating the school's social and physical landscape, memorizing alternative routes through the building that might help her avoid predictable encounters. She timed her movements between classes with mathematical precision, calculating exactly how long she could wait in her previous classroom before needing to move to avoid being late, while also avoiding the peak traffic periods when hallways became hunting grounds. Mental armor became as important as physical navigation, and each morning before walking through Lincoln's front doors, she wrapped herself in psychological defenses that she had developed through trial and error over months of systematic abuse. She threw herself into her academic work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, maintaining a 4.2 GPA that put her in serious contention for valedictorian status, as if perfect grades could somehow shield her from social cruelty or provide evidence of her worth in a system that seemed determined to prove her worthlessness. Her teachers praised her dedication and work ethic in glowing terms, writing recommendation letters that described her as a model student who approached every assignment with thoroughness and care. They never suspected that school had become an endurance test rather than a place of learning, that her academic excellence was born not from love of knowledge, but from desperate need to find something she could control in a world that seemed designed to demonstrate her powerlessness. At home, Kieran continued her martial arts training with increased intensity and focus that surprised even Master Chen, who had been training students for over 30 years and had developed an eye for recognizing when someone was working through anger and frustration rather than simple desire for improvement. He noticed her improved focus during sparring sessions, the way she channeled emotion into precise technique with a dedication that sometimes bordered on ferocity. Her kicks became more powerful, her forms more precise, her sparring more aggressive in ways that spoke to inner turmoil rather than simple competitive spirit. Master Chen was a wise man who understood that martial arts training often attracted people who were dealing with conflicts and challenges outside the studio, and he had learned to recognize the signs of students who were using training as a way to process trauma or prepare for confrontations they anticipated in their daily lives. But when he gently probed about her life outside the studio, asking casual questions about school or friends or family situations, Kieran deflected with the same skill she used to deflect punches during practice sessions. She was fine, she insisted, with the kind of forced cheer that immediately raised red flags for anyone who was paying attention. School was fine, challenging but manageable. She didn't have many close friends, but that was by choice rather than circumstance. She preferred to focus on her studies and her training rather than getting caught up in the drama and complications of typical teenage social relationships. Everything was fine, perfectly normal, exactly what you'd expect from a serious student who took her responsibilities seriously. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November, when autumn air carried the sharp promise of winter and football season was winding down toward the playoffs that would determine which teams advanced to state competition. The leaves on the oak trees in the courtyard had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson before falling to create a carpet that groundskeepers raked into neat piles that students immediately scattered again with the careless enthusiasm of teenagers who found destruction easier than creation. Kieran had been looking forward to this particular day with an anticipation that felt almost foreign after months of dreading her daily arrival at school. Maya Reeves, a new student who had transferred in at the beginning of the semester, had asked to study together for their upcoming chemistry test, an invitation that had stunned Kieran with its casual kindness and apparent sincerity. Maya was everything Kieran wasn't. Confident without being arrogant, outgoing without being loud, pretty in an effortless way that made other girls simultaneously admire and resent her natural grace. She had striking dark hair that caught light when she moved, shifting between brown and auburn depending on the angle and illumination, and brown eyes that seemed to notice everything around her with the curiosity of someone who found the world genuinely interesting rather than threatening. More importantly, from Kieran's perspective, Maya had shown her genuine kindness during their brief interactions over the past several weeks, helping her pick up dropped books without being asked and defending her when Blake made particularly cruel comments within earshot of students who might be inclined to join in the laughter. They had agreed to meet in the library during lunch period, where the academic atmosphere and presence of supervising faculty would provide a safe space for studying and conversation. But first, Kieran needed to retrieve her chemistry notes from her locker, the carefully organized pages of equations and molecular diagrams that she had prepared specifically for their study session. She was mentally reviewing complex molecular structures as she worked her combination, completely absorbed in thoughts of covalent bonds and electron-sharing patterns, the kind of intellectual complexity that provided refuge from the social complexities that dominated most of her waking hours. She didn't notice Trent, Derek, and Blake approaching with the predatory patience of hunters who had spotted isolated prey until it was far too late to escape or seek help from the few scattered students who remained in the hallways during lunch period. Their footsteps were muffled by the industrial carpeting that lined this particular corridor, and their conversation was pitched at the casual level that wouldn't attract attention from anyone who might be passing by. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Trent's voice carried that particular tone that made Kieran's stomach clench with immediate dread, the false friendliness that she had learned to recognize as a prelude to humiliation. "I heard a very interesting rumor that our little bookworm has been making friends." Kieran clutched her chemistry notebook against her chest like a shield and tried to sidestep around them, a maneuver that had occasionally worked in the past when they were more interested in easier targets or when teachers were likely to appear at any moment. But Derek moved smoothly to block her path, with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this particular dance many times before, his bulk filling the hallway in a way that made escape impossible without physical confrontation. The hallway was mostly empty, since lunch had already started, and most students had either gone to the cafeteria or found other places to spend their free period, which meant fewer potential witnesses, but also less chance of adult intervention if the situation escalated beyond verbal harassment into something more serious. "I heard you're tutoring the new girl," Blake added with a smirk that carried implications beyond his words, his tone suggesting that any relationship between Kieran and someone as socially desirable as Maya was inherently suspicious and probably inappropriate. "Maya something or other, pretty girl, way out of your league, don't you think?" "She's just helping me study," Kieran mumbled, her voice barely audible even in the relative quiet of the empty hallway. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, hoping desperately that submission and compliance would make them lose interest and move on to more entertaining targets. Experience had taught her that eye contact was often interpreted as defiance, and defiance always led to escalation. "Maybe we should give Maya a heads up," Trent suggested, his tone carefully casual, but his eyes calculating as he watched for her reaction to the implied threat. "Let her know what kind of person she's wasting her time with. Wouldn't want her to get the wrong idea about our school's standards or the quality of students she should be associating with." The threat was clear and devastating in its implications, and Kieran felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach like a blade made of ice. It was one thing for them to target her. She had learned to absorb their abuse and carry on with her daily routine. But the thought of them turning their attention to Maya because of their association, the possibility that her friendship might expose Maya to the same systematic cruelty that had defined her own high school experience, filled her with a different kind of fear entirely. "Please," Kieran whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of implications she couldn't bear to contemplate. "Just leave her alone." "Oh, now she's begging," Blake said with obvious delight, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully identified a new pressure point to exploit. "This is even better than I thought. She's got a little crush, doesn't she?" The warning bell indicating the end of lunch period rang through the hallways with its familiar electronic tone, and students began filtering back from the cafeteria and other gathering places where they had spent their free time. Kieran thought desperately that she was saved, that the return of normal hallway traffic would force them to disperse to their respective classes and leave her alone to process the encounter and plan her next moves. But as Maya appeared at the end of the hallway, walking toward them with her chemistry textbook tucked under her arm and a friendly smile on her face that spoke of genuine pleasure at seeing Kieran, she realized with sinking heart that the situation was about to become infinitely worse. Maya approached with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having been the target of systematic cruelty, from never having learned to read the subtle signs of predatory behavior that Kieran had been forced to develop through painful experience. "Maya!" Blake called out cheerfully, waving her over with the kind of enthusiasm that might have seemed friendly to someone who didn't understand the context or recognize the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Perfect timing. We were just talking about you." Maya approached with genuine warmth, smiling at Trent and his friends with the kind of openness that Kieran envied and feared in equal measure. She hadn't yet learned to recognize the warning signs that would have sent Kieran running for the nearest teacher or crowded area, hadn't developed the hypervigilance that came from repeated exposure to social predators who disguised their cruelty as harmless teasing. "Hi," she said, then turned to Kieran with obvious pleasure. "Ready for our study session? I brought my notes on ionic compounds, and I think I finally understand the whole electron transfer thing we were struggling with yesterday." "Actually," Trent said, stepping slightly between Maya and Kieran with a movement that appeared casual but effectively cut off their direct line of communication, "we were just discussing whether our little friend here had mentioned her reputation around school." "Her reputation?" Maya asked, genuine confusion evident in her voice as she looked between Trent and Kieran, clearly trying to understand what kind of reputation could possibly be relevant to their planned study session. "That's not true," Maya said firmly when Derek launched into a litany of carefully crafted observations about Kieran being the school's charity case, someone who attracted pity rather than genuine friendship. "Kieran is really smart, and she's been nothing but kind to me since I got here. I don't know what you're talking about." Her defense was immediate and genuine, spoken with the kind of conviction that came from someone who formed her own opinions rather than accepting social consensus as truth. But Kieran could see the confusion in Maya's eyes as she processed the disconnect between her own experience and the picture that Trent's group was painting. "Smart, sure," Blake agreed with mock sincerity that dripped with condescension. "But smart doesn't make up for everything else, you know. The way she dresses, the way she acts all weird and antisocial. Most people think she's kind of creepy, actually, kind of disturbed." The warning was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the social dynamics of high school survival. Associate with Kieran and risk becoming a target yourself. Choose your friends more carefully or face the consequences of poor social judgment. It was the same calculation that dozens of other students had made over the years. The same choice between self-preservation and moral courage that Kieran had watched play out countless times in countless variations. She watched Maya's face as she processed the social mathematics of high school survival, seeing the exact moment when understanding dawned about what was really happening in this hallway encounter. Maya's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like anger, her eyes narrowing as she began to understand the true nature of the boys who had approached them with such apparent friendliness. "Besides," Derek added, reaching out suddenly with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for taking things that didn't belong to him. Maybe Four Eyes here could learn something from your sense of style. These are much nicer frames. His hand shot out to pluck Maya's glasses right off her face with a movement so quick and unexpected that she didn't have time to react or protect herself. The glasses were lightweight designer frames that her parents had purchased after careful consideration of both function and fashion, and they disappeared from her face, leaving her blinking in sudden nearsightedness that transformed the world into a blur of shapes and colors. "Hey, give those back," Maya said, reaching automatically for her glasses with the reflex of someone who had worn them for years and felt genuinely disoriented without the correction they provided. But Derek was already tossing them to Blake with a casual underhand motion that spoke of practiced coordination between the three boys, a well-rehearsed routine that they had probably performed with other students' possessions in similar circumstances. Blake caught them with a grin that revealed genuine pleasure in the power dynamic that had been established, holding the glasses just out of reach as both girls stood between their tormentors. "Let's see how they look on our friend here," Blake said, moving toward Kieran with the glasses held tantalizingly close to her face, but not quite close enough for her to grab them without risking physical contact that might escalate the situation beyond verbal harassment. "Stop it," Maya said, her voice carrying more authority now as she began to understand that this wasn't harmless teasing, but something more systematic and cruel. "Give me my glasses back right now." "Or what?" Blake asked, his tone shifting to something more openly challenging as he recognized that Maya wasn't going to simply submit to their authority the way Kieran had been trained to do through years of systematic conditioning. "You'll report us." "For what, playing keep away?" Kieran could see Maya squinting desperately, trying to focus on what was happening around her without the visual correction she needed to function normally. Without her glasses, Maya's confident posture had shifted to something more uncertain and vulnerable, her usual grace replaced by the careful movements of someone navigating a world that had suddenly become blurry and unpredictable. "Come on, Four Eyes," Derek taunted, holding the glasses higher above Kieran's head in a gesture that was designed to emphasize her small stature and physical helplessness. "Jump for them. Show your new friend how athletic you are." "Please," Kieran said again, hating herself for begging but seeing no other option that wouldn't result in escalation or consequences for Maya. "Just give them back." "Say please like you mean it," Blake demanded, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully established complete dominance over the situation. "Get on your knees and beg properly." The hallway was filling up with students now as the next class period approached, creating an audience for what was unfolding between the two girls and their tormentors. Some hurried past with their eyes carefully averted, having learned through experience that witnessing certain kinds of encounters could make you a target for similar treatment. Others slowed down to watch the entertainment, pulling out phones to record whatever might happen next with the casual cruelty of people who had learned to view others' humiliation as content to be consumed and shared. "This is ridiculous," Maya said, her voice stronger now despite her obvious visual disadvantage as she tried to locate Blake's position through squinting and careful attention to his voice. She started moving toward the sound of his location, reaching determinedly for her glasses with the kind of directness that spoke to someone who wasn't accustomed to having her possessions taken or her autonomy violated. "Whoa there," Trent said, stepping smoothly in front of Maya and placing his hands on her shoulders to stop her progress toward Blake and the glasses he held just out of reach. The touch was brief and could easily be explained as trying to prevent a collision between Maya and one of his friends. But Kieran saw the way Maya flinched slightly at the unexpected physical contact from someone she was beginning to recognize as a threat rather than a helpful classmate. That flinch, barely perceptible but unmistakably genuine, was what finally shattered something fundamental in Kieran's carefully constructed psychological defenses. In that moment of watching Maya's confident composure crack under the pressure of systematic intimidation, she saw her own future reflected with devastating clarity. She saw the gradual erosion of confidence that would follow, the careful calculations about which hallways to avoid and which routes through the school might be safer. She saw Maya learning to make herself smaller, quieter, more invisible, all to avoid the attention of boys who found genuine entertainment in others' fear and helplessness. She saw Maya transforming from an outgoing newcomer who made friends easily and defended others instinctively into a cautious victim who measured every word and movement against its potential to attract unwanted attention. The process would be gradual but inexorable, a systematic destruction of everything that made Maya special and confident and kind. Something crystallized in Kieran's mind with perfect clarity, cutting through years of conditioning and self-doubt like a blade through fog. She had spent 2 years telling herself that her martial arts training was for discipline and self-control, that violence was never the answer to social problems, that rising above their level was the moral choice that would somehow prove her superiority over her tormentors. She had convinced herself that enduring their abuse was noble, that turning the other cheek demonstrated strength rather than weakness. But watching Trent's hands on Maya's shoulders, seeing the calculating look in Blake's eyes as he held the glasses just out of reach like a treat being withheld from a performing animal, she realized with devastating clarity that her inaction wasn't noble, it was complicity. By refusing to defend herself, she had enabled them to perfect their techniques on her before turning them on someone else. Her passive resistance had taught them exactly how far they could push without facing consequences, had given them confidence to expand their operations to include new victims who didn't deserve to suffer simply because they had shown her kindness. The hallway noise seemed to fade into background static as Kieran made her decision, the voices and laughter and slamming lockers becoming distant white noise that couldn't compete with the crystal clarity of purpose that was forming in her mind. Master Chen had taught her that martial arts was fundamentally about protecting yourself and others from harm, that the highest expression of martial discipline was knowing when not to fight, but also knowing when fighting was the only option remaining. He had also taught her that sometimes the most disciplined response was the one that stopped a threat before it could escalate further, that preventing future harm sometimes required accepting responsibility for necessary violence in the present moment. The distinction between aggression and protection was often subtle, but always crucial, and she realized that she had been so focused on avoiding the former that she had failed to recognize her responsibility for the latter. "Give her the glasses back," Kieran said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Blake look at her with genuine surprise for the first time in their long relationship of predator and prey. "Excuse me," Blake laughed, but there was something uncertain in his expression as he processed the change in her demeanor, the subtle shift in posture that suggested something fundamental had changed in their dynamic. Did the mouse just squeak? "I said give her the glasses back," Kieran repeated, stepping forward with deliberate purpose. Her posture had changed subtly but significantly, her weight shifting onto the balls of her feet in a stance that looked casual to untrained observers but would allow for explosive movement in any direction. Her hands, which had been clutching her notebook defensively against her chest, now hung loosely at her sides in a position that appeared relaxed, but provided maximum flexibility for defensive or offensive action. "Or what?" Derek asked, moving to flank her with the automatic coordination that came from years of working together to intimidate isolated targets. "You'll tell the principal on us?" Kieran looked at Maya, who was still squinting in their direction and trying to follow the conversation by sound while dealing with the disorientation of sudden visual impairment. She thought about all the students who had watched her humiliation over the years, who had learned through her example that bullies faced no real consequences for their actions, that systematic cruelty was simply an accepted part of high school social dynamics that victims had to endure in silence. "Or I'll take them back," she said simply, the words carrying a finality that made all three boys pause as they tried to process this unprecedented response from someone they had categorized as permanently helpless. The words hung in the air for a moment that stretched longer than seemed physically possible, and Kieran could see the exact instant when Trent, Derek and Blake realized that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully established dynamic. The quiet girl who had absorbed their abuse for 2 years without complaint or resistance was looking at them with steady eyes that held no trace of the fear they had become accustomed to seeing and exploiting. "You'll take them back?" Trent repeated slowly, as if the concept was so foreign to his understanding of their relationship that he needed to hear it again to believe it had actually been spoken. "That's right," Kieran said, taking another deliberate step forward that closed the distance between herself and Blake, who was still holding Maya's glasses with the confident assumption that his physical advantages would prevent any serious challenge to his authority. Blake held the glasses higher, grinning with the kind of anticipatory pleasure that came from someone who expected to add another humiliating defeat to his collection of victories over weaker opponents. "I'd like to see you try 4 eyes." What happened next took less than 3 seconds from beginning to end, but to the students watching in the hallway, recording with their phones and trying to process what they were witnessing, it seemed to unfold in slow motion, like a sequence from an action movie that had been slowed down for dramatic effect. Kieran moved forward with the fluid precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours drilling the same movements until they became instinct rather than conscious action, her body responding to years of training that had been waiting patiently for the moment when it would finally be needed. Her right hand shot upward to grab Blake's wrist, not with the desperate clutching of someone reaching frantically for an object, but with the controlled grip of someone who understood leverage and joint manipulation with scientific precision. Her fingers found the exact pressure points that Master Chen had taught her during countless lessons on self-defense, applying force with surgical accuracy to nerve clusters that would cause immediate discomfort without inflicting permanent damage. Blake's confident grin faltered and then disappeared entirely as he felt the specific kind of pressure that indicated his opponent understood exactly which nerves to target for maximum effect. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced before, a precise discomfort that spoke to knowledge and training rather than lucky accident or desperate flailing. Before he could react or attempt to pull away, Kieran's left hand moved with equal precision to capture Maya's glasses, while her right hand applied just enough additional pressure to make Blake release them reflexively. The movement was so smooth and coordinated that it looked almost choreographed, like a dance that had been practiced extensively rather than a spontaneous response to an unexpected situation. "What the hell?" Derek started forward with the automatic aggression of someone whose worldview had just been challenged in ways he didn't understand. But he stopped abruptly when Kieran turned to face him with the same calm expression that had replaced her usual fearful submission. She handed the glasses to Maya with careful gentleness, her movement so fluid that it seemed to be part of the same motion that had retrieved them from Blake's possession. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 3 seconds, but it had fundamentally altered the dynamic of the encounter in ways that none of the participants were entirely prepared to process. "Are you okay?" Kieran asked Maya, her voice soft with genuine concern, while her posture remained alert and ready for whatever might come next. Maya slipped her glasses back onto her face and blinked as the world came back into sharp focus, her expression cycling through surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been admiration as she processed what had just happened. When she looked at Kieran now, there was a new understanding in her eyes, a recognition that there was more to her quiet study partner than anyone had suspected. "I'm fine," Maya said, her voice carrying a warmth that spoke to genuine appreciation for what Kieran had done. "Thank you." The simple exchange seemed to enrage Blake, who was still rubbing his wrist and staring at Kieran with a mixture of disbelief and growing hostility that spoke to someone whose fundamental assumptions about power and helplessness had just been shattered. "You think you're tough now? You think grabbing someone's wrist makes you some kind of badass?" "I think taking someone's glasses makes you a bully," Kieran replied, with a calmness that was more unsettling than any dramatic display of anger would have been. "And I think it stops now." "It stops when we say it stops," Trent said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, the kind of barely controlled aggression that came from someone who felt his authority being challenged in ways he didn't know how to handle. "Actually," Kieran said, meeting his gaze directly for what felt like the first time in their years of interaction, "it stops now." The hallway had grown noticeably quieter as more students stopped to watch, sensing that whatever was happening between these four people was unprecedented in the school's recent social history. Some had their phones out, instinctively recording what they recognized might be a moment worth preserving and sharing, while others simply stared in fascination at the transformation of someone they had categorized as permanently powerless. "You know what your problem is?" Trent said, stepping closer to Kieran with the kind of physical intimidation that had always worked in the past, using his height advantage to loom over her in a way that was designed to emphasize her small size and apparent vulnerability. "You don't understand your place here. You don't understand how things work at this school." "I understand perfectly," Kieran replied, her voice carrying the same unsettling calm that seemed to be unsettling all three boys in different ways. "You pick on people you think won't fight back, and when someone finally does, you can't handle it." Derek moved to Kieran's left while Blake circled around to her right, and she recognized the formation immediately from her training in dealing with multiple attackers. It was the same triangular positioning that predators used instinctively to isolate and intimidate prey, designed to make the target feel surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. 2 years ago, when she had first encountered this same formation, it would have worked exactly as intended, sending her into a panic that would have made organized resistance impossible. But the person standing in this hallway was not the same girl who had first cowered under their attention, who had learned to associate their presence with inevitable humiliation and pain. 8 years of martial arts training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to analyze threats objectively rather than reacting with emotion, and to recognize when defensive action was not only justified but necessary to prevent further escalation. "Last chance," Trent said, his voice carrying the kind of false reasonableness that bullies used as a final warning before escalating to physical violence, the mock diplomacy that would allow him to claim he had tried to resolve the situation peacefully. "Apologize for putting your hands on Blake, and we'll forget this whole thing happened." Kieran glanced around at the students watching from what they thought was a safe distance, seeing the mixture of anticipation and fear on their faces as they tried to predict what would happen next. She saw the way they held their phones ready to capture whatever violence might unfold, preparing to turn someone's pain into entertainment that could be shared and consumed by others who hadn't been present for the original encounter. She thought about all the times she had seen this same dynamic play out with other victims, how the presence of an audience always seemed to escalate situations beyond what they might have been in private. But she also recognized that this moment had significance beyond just her own immediate situation, that how she responded now would send a message to everyone watching about what was acceptable and what consequences bullies could expect when they finally encountered someone willing to resist. "No," she said simply, the single word carrying more finality and determination than entire speeches might have conveyed. Blake, still rubbing his wrist and clearly angry about the humiliation he had just experienced in front of an audience that was recording everything for later distribution, made the first aggressive move. He lunged forward with the kind of wild, emotional swing that came from anger rather than any kind of training or strategic thinking, his fist aimed generally toward Kieran's face with the assumption that his size and aggression would overwhelm any defense she might attempt. To someone who had spent years practicing defensive techniques against opponents of all sizes and skill levels, his approach was not only telegraphed, but almost comically obvious in its lack of sophistication. Kieran sidestepped his attack with the fluid grace of someone who had drilled the same movement thousands of times, using his own momentum against him in a way that required minimal effort on her part, but maximum effectiveness in terms of results. The hip throw she applied was one of the most basic techniques in her arsenal, something she had learned in her first year of training, and perfected through years of practice against partners who ranged from other beginners to advanced black belts. Blake's size actually worked against him in this situation, his greater mass making the throw more devastating when properly applied. He tumbled to the floor with a crash that echoed through the hallway like thunder, the impact of his body against the polished linoleum loud enough to make several students jump in surprise. The sound seemed to galvanize Derek, who had been watching Blake's attack with the assumption that Kieran's successful defense had been lucky rather than skillful. He rushed at her from her left side with the kind of straightforward aggression that had always worked against untrained opponents, using his wrestler's bulk to try to overwhelm her through sheer physical force. But Master Chen had drilled her extensively on dealing with multiple attackers, emphasizing that the key to success was never to allow them to coordinate their attacks or use their numbers advantage effectively. She was ready for Derek's approach before he had fully committed to it, her training allowing her to read his body language and anticipate his movement with the kind of precision that came from years of sparring against opponents who were trying their best to hurt her. The foot sweep she used to counter his attack was another fundamental technique, but one that required precise timing and positioning to be effective against a moving target. She caught Derek's ankle at exactly the right moment in his stride, when his weight was committed forward and his balance was most vulnerable to disruption. The result sent him sprawling across the floor in a tangle of limbs that looked almost comical in its completeness. His wrestler's training completely useless against a technique he had never encountered or prepared for. Trent stood frozen, staring at his two friends on the ground, then at Kieran, who remained standing calmly in the center of the hallway, with her backpack still properly positioned on her shoulders and her breathing barely elevated despite the intense physical activity she had just engaged in. She wasn't disheveled, wasn't even breathing hard, and her expression remained as calm and controlled as it had been throughout the entire encounter. "How?" Trent asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, his voice carrying genuine bewilderment as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. 8 years of taekwondo, Kieran replied matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather or announcing the time rather than revealing the secret that had allowed her to neutralize 2 attackers without breaking a sweat. "I just never saw the point in mentioning it before." The words hung in the air as Blake and Derek slowly picked themselves up from the floor, both of them moving more carefully now and looking at Kieran with expressions that contained wariness and confusion in equal measure. The entire dynamic of their relationship had been permanently altered in the space of less than a minute. The fundamental assumptions about power and helplessness that had governed their interactions for years shattered beyond any possibility of repair. Students who had been recording on their phones were already beginning to upload videos to social media platforms, ensuring that this encounter would be preserved and shared far beyond the immediate audience that had witnessed it firsthand. By the end of the school day, everyone at Lincoln High would know that the quiet girl who had been a target for systematic abuse had finally fought back, and had done so with a level of skill and control that suggested her previous submission had been a choice rather than an inevitability. The confrontation that would define everything came 2 days later, after school in the parking lot, where students gathered to wait for rides or begin their walks home through the suburban neighborhoods that surrounded Lincoln High. The asphalt was still warm from the afternoon sun, and the air carried the smell of autumn leaves and the distant smoke from someone's fireplace, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension that was building between groups of students who had positioned themselves to watch what everyone knew was coming. Trent had spent the intervening days dealing with the humiliation of watching his friends get effortlessly defeated by someone he had considered completely powerless, and the social media footage of the encounter had spread throughout the school's social networks with the viral intensity that only comes from content that fundamentally challenges established hierarchies. He felt compelled to reassert his dominance in a more public setting, gathering several other students who normally stayed on the periphery of his activities, but who were drawn by the promise of witnessing what promised to be a legendary confrontation. "You think you're tough because you got lucky in the hallway," Trent announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear, his voice carrying the kind of forced confidence that came from someone who was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. But that was just cheap tricks and dirty fighting. "If you want a fair fight," Kieran responded, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot without any need for theatrical volume, "then let's have one. Just you and me, Trent. No friends, no cheap shots, no excuses." The crowd stirred with excitement as they recognized that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years, a moment that would become part of Lincoln High's legendary confrontations. Someone shouted, "Fight!" and others took up the chant, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made it impossible for either participant to back down without losing face completely. Trent looked around at the faces surrounding them, recognizing that he was trapped by his own carefully cultivated image and the expectations that came with his position in the school's social hierarchy. To back down now would be to admit that his power had always been an illusion, that his authority was based on others' willingness to submit rather than any genuine strength or capability on his part. "Fine," he said, shrugging off his letter jacket with theatrical deliberation and handing it to one of his supporters with the kind of ceremony that was designed to build anticipation and emphasize the significance of the moment. "But when I put you in the hospital, don't come crying about how unfair it was." The crowd formed a rough circle around them, with the efficiency of people who had witnessed similar confrontations before, everyone pulling out phones to record what they sensed would be a legendary moment in Lincoln High history that would be shared and analyzed for months to come. Kieran could see Maya near the edge of the circle, her expression worried but supportive, along with several other students who seemed genuinely concerned about the outcome, but were afraid to intervene in a situation that had taken on the momentum of a natural disaster. Trent moved with the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, his size and athletic training giving him every reason to believe that he could overwhelm someone half his weight through sheer physical dominance. His first punch was a powerful right cross aimed directly at Kieran's face, the kind of devastating haymaker that would have ended most fights before they really began, sending his opponent to the ground with the kind of dramatic finality that would cement his reputation and restore the social order that had been disrupted by recent events. But Kieran wasn't most people, and she certainly wasn't the helpless victim that Trent still believed her to be, despite evidence to the contrary. She had spent years training against opponents who were larger, stronger, and more experienced than herself, learning to use speed, technique, and strategic thinking to overcome physical disadvantages that seemed insurmountable to untrained observers. Master Chen had drilled into her the fundamental principle that size and strength were only advantages if you could actually connect with your target, and that proper defensive technique could turn an opponent's power against them. She slipped Trent's punch with a subtle movement of her head that required perfect timing and spatial awareness, letting his fist whistle past her ear, close enough for her to feel the wind of its passage, but far enough away to avoid any damage. The miss threw Trent off balance in exactly the way she had anticipated, his forward momentum carrying him past his intended target and leaving him vulnerable to counterattack. Kieran took advantage of his momentary vulnerability to land a precise kick to his solar plexus, a strike that was calculated for maximum impact on his breathing and balance without causing permanent injury. It wasn't a devastating blow designed to end the fight immediately, but it was enough to double him over and force him to step back, gasping for air and beginning to understand that this encounter wasn't going to follow the script he had anticipated. What followed was less a fight than a demonstration of the difference between trained technique and raw aggression. Kieran moved like water around Trent's increasingly frantic attacks, flowing around his punches and kicks with an economy of motion that made her look almost lazy compared to his desperate expenditure of energy. Every few seconds, she would dart in with a quick strike of her own, a precise palm strike to his ribs that would leave him sore for days, a kick to his thigh that temporarily numbed his leg, a punch to his shoulder that made his arm go limp for several seconds. While Trent grew more winded and desperate with each exchange, his attacks becoming wilder and less coordinated as fatigue and frustration took their toll. Kieran remained calm and controlled throughout the encounter. Her breathing was steady, her movements economical, and her expression never changed from the focused concentration of someone who was engaged in a technical exercise rather than an emotional confrontation. "Stand still and fight," Trent shouted in frustration, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who was beginning to understand that all his assumptions about physical confrontation were being systematically dismantled by someone who understood violence in ways he had never imagined. He launched himself at her in a tackle that might have worked against an untrained opponent, using his football experience to try to bring her to the ground where his size advantage might prove decisive. But Kieran sidestepped his charge with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout the fight, using his momentum against him to help him crash into the chain-link fence that bordered the parking lot. The metallic clang of his impact silenced the crowd momentarily, the sound carrying a finality that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of schoolyard confrontations. When Trent turned around to face her again, there was blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the fence, the red stream creating a stark visual reminder of how completely the encounter had shifted from his expectations. "I am fighting," Kieran replied calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent parking lot. "This is what real fighting looks like." What followed was indeed a demonstration rather than a competitive fight, with Kieran moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours perfecting her craft, while Trent flailed with the desperate energy of someone watching his reputation and self-image crumble in real time. She controlled the distance between them effortlessly, staying just out of range of his increasingly wild attacks while landing her own strikes with surgical precision that spoke to years of training against opponents who were genuinely trying to hurt her. Her technique was flawless, her timing perfect, and her control absolute. Each strike was measured and purposeful, designed to demonstrate her superiority without inflicting unnecessary damage or crossing the line into cruelty that would make her no better than her former tormentors. She was proving a point rather than seeking revenge, showing everyone present that strength came from discipline and training rather than size and aggression. The end came when Trent, driven by desperation and wounded pride beyond any rational thought, picked up a rock from the parking lot asphalt and hurled it at Kieran's head with the kind of wild abandon that crossed the line from schoolyard fight into genuine assault with a potentially deadly weapon. The action drew gasps from the watching crowd, who recognized that the encounter had suddenly escalated beyond anything they had expected or wanted to witness. Kieran ducked under the projectile with reflexes that had been honed by years of dodging training weapons and sparring partners who were trying their best to score points against her. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, her movement so fast and purposeful that Trent didn't have time to react or prepare any defense against what was coming. Her response was swift, decisive, and utterly devastating in its precision. The jumping kick that caught Trent squarely in the chest was one of her most advanced techniques, requiring perfect timing, balance, and power generation to execute properly. The impact sent him flying backward through the air to land hard on the asphalt several feet away, his body hitting the pavement with a sound that made several students in the crowd wince in sympathetic pain. This time he didn't get up immediately. He lay on his back, staring up at the sky with an expression that mixed pain, confusion, and what might have been the first genuine fear he had ever experienced in a physical confrontation. His chest rose and fell with labored breathing as he struggled to process what had just happened and whether he had the strength or will to continue fighting. The parking lot was completely silent now, except for the sound of Trent's breathing and the distant noise of traffic from the street beyond the school grounds. Kieran stood over him with her fists still raised in a defensive position, ready to continue if necessary, but hoping that the lesson had been delivered with sufficient clarity to make further violence unnecessary. "Stay down," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the stillness that had fallen over the assembled crowd. For a long moment, it looked like the fight was finally over. Trent appeared to be finished, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath and process the reality of his complete defeat at the hands of someone he had systematically underestimated. The crowd waited in tense silence to see if Kieran would press her advantage, if she would deliver the kind of brutal finishing move that would cement her victory and his humiliation in ways that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. But as Trent struggled to sit up, as she saw the genuine fear in his eyes for what she realized was probably the first time in his life, Kieran made a different choice. Instead of striking again, instead of taking advantage of his vulnerability to inflict the kind of damage that might satisfy her years of pent-up anger and frustration, she stepped back and lowered her hands in a gesture that spoke to mercy rather than vengeance. "It's over," she said, addressing not just Trent but the entire crowd that had gathered to watch his downfall. "We're done here." The words carried a finality that made everyone present understand that they had witnessed something more significant than just another high school fight. They had seen the transformation of someone who had been systematically victimized into someone who had reclaimed her power, but who had chosen to exercise that power with restraint and dignity, rather than using it to become the very thing she had been fighting against. As the crowd began to disperse, students talking excitedly among themselves and already beginning to upload footage to social media platforms that would ensure this encounter became legendary throughout the school and beyond, Kieran felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The fear that had dominated her high school experience was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she could defend herself and others when necessary. 2 weeks after the parking lot incident that had fundamentally altered the social dynamics of Lincoln High School, Kieran was surprised to find Trent waiting by her locker after school, a development that would have filled her with dread just a month earlier, but now simply made her curious about what he might want to say. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and his usual confidence replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like humility, a transformation that several passing students noticed with obvious surprise. The cut on his forehead had healed, leaving only a faint scar that would probably fade with time. But there were deeper changes that were more significant than any physical injury. His posture was different, less commanding and more uncertain, and he no longer moved through the hallways with the automatic assumption that others would make way for his passage. "I wanted to apologize," Trent said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them, but was still afraid he might lose his nerve before getting them out. "For everything. For the past 2 years, for what we did to you, for being a bully. I don't really have an excuse for it, and I'm not going to try to make one up. I just thought it was funny, I guess. I thought it made me look cool or tough or whatever." He shook his head with obvious self-disgust. "I never really thought about how it affected you, which I know makes me sound like a complete psychopath, but it's the truth." Kieran studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine remorse and confusion about his own previous behavior. "What changed?" she asked, genuinely curious about what could have prompted such a dramatic shift in someone who had seemed so committed to his role as a predator. Trent was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor as if the words he needed might be written there in script only he could read. "Watching that video," he finally said, "seeing myself get beat up by someone half my size, seeing how pathetic I looked, how desperate and angry and just wrong, but also seeing how you could have kept going when I was down, how you could have really hurt me and you chose not to. You could have made me look even worse than I already did, but you stopped when you didn't have to." "Violence should never be the first choice," Kieran said, the words carrying the weight of years of training and philosophical discussion with Master Chen about the proper role of martial arts in dealing with conflict. "But sometimes it's the only language bullies understand." "I understand now," Trent said, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed genuine. "And I'm sorry, really truly sorry. I know it doesn't undo anything that happened. I know it doesn't give you back the time or the confidence or whatever else we took from you, but I wanted you to know that I get it now. I understand what we were doing, and I understand why it was wrong." Kieran studied his face for a moment longer, searching for any sign that this was another manipulation or attempt to regain some kind of psychological advantage over her. But she saw only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine shame, the expression of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his behavior. "Apology accepted," she said finally, the words feeling strange in her mouth after years of imagining what this moment might be like. "But it's not just about me, Trent. It's about everyone you and your friends have targeted over the years. And it's about making sure it doesn't happen again to anyone else." "It won't," Trent said quickly, almost interrupting her in his eagerness to provide reassurance. "As far as I'm concerned, that whole thing is over, done. Blake and Derek feel the same way. We talked about it, and we all agreed that we were idiots, and that we're not going to be idiots anymore." As Trent walked away, his shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he was still processing the conversation and its implications, Kieran reflected on how strange it felt to have closure after so long. The boy who had made her life miserable for 2 years had just apologized with what seemed like genuine remorse, acknowledging not just that his behavior had been wrong, but that he understood why it had been wrong. Maya appeared at her elbow, having waited at a discreet distance during the conversation with the kind of sensitivity that spoke to her growing understanding of the complexities of Kieran's situation and the significance of what had just occurred. "How does it feel?" Maya asked, her voice soft with genuine curiosity about the emotional impact of receiving an apology that had been years in the making. "Different than I thought it would," Kieran admitted, surprised by her own reaction to the encounter. "I spent so long being angry at him, fantasizing about what I would say if he ever acknowledged what he had done, and now I mostly just feel sorry for him." "Sorry for him?" Maya asked, clearly not having expected that particular emotional response to someone who had caused so much pain over such an extended period. "Think about it," Kieran said, as they walked toward the exit together, their footsteps echoing in the hallway that had been the site of so many previous confrontations. He spent 2 years thinking his value came from making other people feel small. He found entertainment in other people's pain, and he convinced himself that was normal and acceptable. What kind of person must you be inside to live that way? They stepped out into the afternoon sunshine, and Kieran felt a sense of peace that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to remember. The school that had once felt like a prison, a place where she served a daily sentence of humiliation and fear, now felt like just a building where she happened to spend her days learning things that would help her build the future she wanted. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still students who looked at her strangely, still whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, still the residual social awkwardness that came from having been categorized as a victim for so long. But the fundamental dynamic had changed in ways that could never be reversed. She was no longer powerless, no longer defined by others' willingness to prey upon her perceived weakness. Looking back at Lincoln High as they walked toward the parking lot where Maya's mother was waiting to give them both rides home, Kieran thought about all the students still inside those walls who were fighting their own battles against bullies and systematic indifference. She hoped that her story would reach some of them, would show them that powerlessness was often a choice and that sometimes the most important fight was the one you finally decided to have. She had learned that standing up for yourself didn't automatically make you a bully in return, as long as you remembered to extend your hand to help others up, rather than using your newfound strength to keep them down. The difference between a victim and a survivor, she realized, was sometimes just the willingness to say no and mean it, regardless of the potential consequences. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very careful about how you wielded the power you had fought so hard to reclaim, standing up for yourself showed others that they could stand up too, creating ripples of courage that spread far beyond your own small corner of the world and touched lives you might never even know about.